Good evening, and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI, and I am glad you've joined us this evening, where I'll present some of the work I've been doing the past year on moral injury, the northeast of England, and tailored pastoral care. I want to say just a few brief words about the International Center for Moral Injury, or as we say, the ICMI, which is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. And each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. Lastly, let me just note that all conversations on moral injury may evoke intense reactions within us. I'll be discussing narratives of moral injury that are at times raw and direct. So please do exercise self-care in stepping away if you need to, and know that there is help available if you feel overwhelmed. So I think this brings us to what I feel is the Austin Powers moment of the evening when I'm presenting, where I allow myself to introduce myself. Just so a quick narrative there. My name again is Brian Powers. I come from a military background as a former Special Operations Weather Team officer and detachment commander, and veteran of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. I left the military in 2007 to attend seminary in my own home tradition, Presbyterian Church USA, and spent 9 years in graduate school interrogating my own faith amidst my experience of war, emerging with a PhD in systematic theology from Emory University, but really with a deep appreciation for the capacity of Christian theology to name and provide rich frameworks of meaning around contemporary moral issues, which is just to say this work is both personal and kind of vocational for me. Since arriving in Durham in 2018, I've continued theological writing and research, but really with the advent of the ICMI in 2022, have also expanded to bring a theological and spiritual lens to collaborative and empirical work on moral injury. And this project this evening is a part of that work. So I'm going to just take a moment and share my screen. Okay. So like I said, the northeast of England in a particular context, and how we might tailor pastoral care for this particular region, for those clergy and perhaps even chaplains who are encountering service members and veterans that they think might be morally injured. So let me just say, if this is your first webinar with us, I will take just a moment and talk about moral injury, because otherwise I will blow right past it and we will be moving quickly. So there's two definitions really that give kind of the boundaries, you might say, of what are kind of really the major frameworks in which different definitions operate. The first is from Jonathan Shea, who coined the term moral injury in the early 1990s as a US VA psychiatrist in Boston. He noted from working with Vietnam veterans that moral injury is present when there's been a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. Later on, in about 2009, another team of US-based researchers led by Brett Litz really opens up the clinical research and expands that. Litz and et al. Note that moral injury is perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral belief. I'll come back to the formation of those in just a moment. I just want to say that at the ICMI, we've tried to incorporate both aspects of those, really the betrayal that Shea points to, as well as the ways in which we do experience moral emotions for the violations of moral values that we ourselves do. So the ICMI definition is that moral injury refers to the experience of sustained and enduring negative moral emotions, guilt, shame, contempt, and anger, that result from the betrayal, violation, or suppression of deeply held or shared moral values. So just to give you a bit of an overview for if this is new to you, to what moral injury might encompass. So tonight I'm going to structure things this way. I'm going to talk a bit about the study that I'm doing particularly, but really also spend a few minutes looking at making the case of why we do why we do and why we should do more contextual studies of moral injury. And by that, I mean why we look at moral injury in a particular context and pay attention to why and how that particular context might affect that experience. Talk about, again, moral injury in the northeast of England, the study highlights. Some key principles as I developed the resources from the empirical work and the thematic analysis, and then some of those resources and walk through the logic and what those are. So just to note on this particular project, it was generously funded by the William Leach Research Fund. It does have myself as the sole researcher. It's just me doing this. And again, the aim is to provide tailored theological and pastoral resources for morally injured veterans here. We did that through qualitative interviews with clergy, chaplains, and veterans in the Northeast. I used that interview data to produce a thematic analysis to find out where the common themes were and what people were talking about, and then produced, again, pastoral resources in order to do that. And I'll say a bit more about the methodology there in just a moment. But I wanted to note that make a brief case for why this, again, contextual kind of study is important. As I just pointed out with Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz, the clinical concept of moral injury develops in the United States in a US context. It's really the center of other attempts beyond Litz and Shea to define it as well. There's work done on it at Duke University with Warren Kinghorn, a couple others at Fuller University or Fuller Seminary in California. But the US really emerges in the early going of this as the primary driver of the definitions and the concepts that those are used. Similarly, the theological work that's begun with Rita Nakashima-Brock and Gabriella Latini also comes from an American context, and it's followed by myself, Michael Yandel, Zachary Moon, and a few others who, in developing a lot of those concepts, are also doing so with American values in the background and the American experience in the background. Myself, Michael Yandel, and Zachary Moon, all US military veterans in that sense. So there is a distinct way in which even the theological work done is done and addressed to a particularly American audience. So his work is now done in other clinical contexts, and certainly it's happening now all over the world. Clinical studies here at KCL's King Center for Military Health Research, for military mental health research, for example, work led by Tina Molendijk in the Netherlands and Lindsay Carey in Australia. As it's done, there's largely a couple of assumptions that are made but rarely acknowledged. So if we take, for example, the fact that the US context deeply shaped the definitions and conversations, then we kind of have to either tacitly assume that either those US researchers found a concept that's deeply rooted in the violation of socialized and cultural value that's universal to all humans, regardless of their culture or social mores, or that those values are distinct and different across different cultures. And thus, moral injury might have developed, might be conceived differently if it were to be conceptually developed in other places. So, how do we navigate that reality? And how do we separate what is certainly there are some universal human aspects of moral injury from the fact that values, understandings of treatment, experience, society vary greatly, and thus parts of US definitions will not fit well with experiences of those from other cultures? And from a Christian theological point of view, how do we think about things like identity, ourselves in relation to others, and how the Christian symbol systems are utilized in pastoral care for morally injured veterans in places that aren't the US, given that intentional developmental formation? So, in other words, despite that worldwide work, those origin phases us to navigate those in particular ways. I'll just make a final statement on how critical I think this is. Uh, as we know, as we continue to wrestle in what I think are largely helpful ways in terms of interdisciplinary and clinical context about what moral injury is. There's a 2025 paper that really put forth a definition and a proposal for what a moral injury disorder might look like to be included in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-6, the next iteration of the diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. And so they argue they have three phases of the definition that they propose. One is that believe moral distress, moral injury, and then moral injury disorder. The yellow definition here is the definition of moral injury. So persistent distress that arises because personal experience disrupts or threatens A, one's sense of goodness or oneself, of others, of institutions, or of what are understood to be higher powers, or one's beliefs or intuitions about right and wrong or good and evil, so as to cause impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. But the part that they tack on to the moral injury disorder definition they propose is all of that, but in ways that are out of proportion or inconsistent with cultural or religious norms concerning such experiences. So, in other words, I think this effort comes about as a desire to pin down what moral injury is in a very objective way. And yet you've tacked on a key critical point of that that's going to vary subjectively an incredible amount in different contexts. Who gets to decide what a cultural or religious norm is? Those are questions that echo throughout, and I think it's important to realize we do need contextual studies of moral injury to appreciate those differences, particularly if this is going to be the way we define formally a disorder. So, just a case to why I think this is important, and hopefully that will become evident a bit later as I move through the study. There's the citation for that. Excuse me, Tyler Vanderweel. This is the main author of that paper, or the primary one. So I know that, forgive me if you're joining us from the United Kingdom, and this is going to seem like I'm belittling your intelligence, but since we have such a broad audience, I thought I might say, when I say the northeast of England, let me pin this down just a tiny bit geographically when I say what we mean. And I'm aware this is contentious at varying points as well. In orange here is obviously the United Kingdom as it sits above Europe. Within that, the northeast of England is this area in red here. It's an area that extends essentially from the northern part of Yorkshire through County Durham, Newcastle, Sunderland, metropolitan areas to the North Sea, and then Northumbria to the north up to the Scottish border. So this is the area that we roughly say encompasses the northeast of England. So why do this contextual study and try to tailor pastoral resources for this particular region? Well, there's pragmatic reasons. One I already named was we have an interested funder that is interested in exploring this particular aspect of this particular region. The locality of Durham University makes it relatively easy to go and interview participants for it. However, there's many more perhaps serendipitous reasons why this region presents a fascinating case study in the larger discourse. It's an incredibly complex region with a rich history and a profound sense of its own identity. Um, I could go on for a long time, but it's really impressive. There's a couple of resources I could point to. Dan Jackson's book called "The Northumbrians" is really impressive for a historical background. But just to say, in reference quickly to that, the richness and diversity of that history, Durham exists as a city, for example, because the Vikings raiding the English coast began to trouble Lindisfarne Island, and the monks there who carried the body of the northern Saint Cuthbert to Durham, where they settled, and a shrine church and cathedral eventually grew up around where they reinterred him. The border community, as I just noted geographically with Scotland, means that it's been centuries of conflict and shaped by that as well. The rich industrial history of mining, rail yards, shipbuilding, chemical industries also shape its character, and though it becomes known for that kind of uh, particularly working class industry. There's also, however, academic centers in Durham, of course, and in Newcastle, profound urban and metropolitan areas in Newcastle and Sunderland, um, as well as rural lands to the west in County Durham and to the north in Northumbria. All kinds of ways in which we generalize won't capture the sense of diversity within the region. So that it's impossible to do so. I mentioned that at the outset to say any generalization feels like an impoverished way of understanding the region, and it certainly is, because within the region, there is, again, incredibly diverse history that exists. Um, but there's also, having said that, a bit of potential collective moral injury in the narrative of the region's history as well. the deindustrialization present in the 1980s and early 1990s. That means the closing of the pits, the miners' strikes, and the way that it was handled by the government of Westminster, the way that that way of life was essentially more or less closed off without any meaningful sense of reinvestment. Numerous projects, attempts to level up, have not been followed through on, you might say, by the British government. Um, and so there's a sense that that collective moral injury is there and present in the cultural ethos. Because of all those things, there's obviously a common perception that the region has a distinctive character, ethos, and values. It's also interesting to study in terms of moral injury because it has a significant veteran population, only second among regions in the United Kingdom to the southwest of England. And its recruiting numbers are still strong, particularly as a percentage of its population. It sends a greater percentage of its population to the military still as of the numbers in 2025 than any other region, with the exception of the Southwest. I did have to develop a spreadsheet to input the recruiting numbers to verify that claim from a member of parliament, but it is true uh, in that sense. So the Northeast has a rich history and as well as a military tradition that makes this particularly valuable. So the methodology for the study, again, mixed methods is the truest way to describe this. I did a good bit of individual research before coming into this, just to develop some sense of the kind of questions to ask interviewees for the region. Conducted and recruited both, again, chaplains, clergy, and veterans. I tried to get clinicians in the Northeast involved in this, but there was a bit of an ethical snafu just with the NHS. It takes a little bit longer than we had for the project to do that, but would love to do that, pursue that in the future. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with 17 different people that fit those into one of those categories, and some stretching across different categories of clergy, former military chaplains, and veterans in the region. I asked them several questions, which I'll get to in a moment, then grouped some of those answers in a thematic analysis, then really looked at and considered how those answers about both value, experiences of moral injury, and what moral repair might look like, kind of what those themes were and how that might affect the experience of or theological care, pastoral care in that setting, and what resources would be helpful, how we might tweak the current theology written on the subject, what resources are available that might fit well given that. And so I asked a series of questions of each person. They varied a little bit different depending on whether I was talking to a chaplain, a clergy member, or a veteran. I asked several just around values of the region. Mainly, again, if moral injury is a betrayal or violation of some deeply held cultural value, I was trying to get at just how they might be different and then how that might affect the experience of moral injury. So I asked three questions in there, basically. Does the Northeast have a distinctive set of values? Does it have a particular ethos? And what makes it unique? I also asked veterans, particularly, what emotions they might have that are associated with their service. I asked about experiences of moral injury. I introduced the term a little bit if they weren't familiar with it. Um, I asked them what moral repair looks like for them. Also asked veterans what experiences they'd had with chaplains or clergy and how those went. And there's some actually really interesting insights that came up from that question as well. And I'm going to move into the section where I talk about the values of the region that were answered. I should say these are the perceived values carefully. When I interviewed 17 participants, again, there's no way to capture in any way the rich diversity of the region. So these are the perceived values that they answered with, that they understood to be distinctive about the region. And particularly to avoid caricatures, I tried to portray them not as singular, not one singular value, but values that were in tension with each other, points that where there's a bit of a spectrum between two different things. And I tried to set it up that way in ways that were consistent with what the answers were. So I'll walk through those in a bit more detail and pull out some of the quotes that describe them well. The first and the most common answer received was certainly um, that the Northeast was defined by a sense of community. That was the perception among nearly all the participants. And it has a bit of a nuance about, depending on how class and accent play into that sense of community. And some of these answers might bring that out. So you see, one, I think that what the Northerners have is a community ethic, community spirit, which when I was growing up was really, really obvious as a small, even primary school age child. Another, there's a strong community here, even with the incomers, even the incomers from the South and stuff get caught up in this. There's a community here and they look out for one another. That sense of looking out for one another came up frequently as well. That sense of community was not just a vague one where people said hello, but actually was involved with a deeper sense of care than they experienced in other regions. And that third quote again emphasized that a bit more. Feels like more of a sense of belonging because you don't quite feel so disconnected from everybody else around you because of that sense of shared values and friendliness. And it is an opposition that doesn't necessarily have to be oppositional, but for being up here, it does feel like that's opposed to the rest of the country. And just to drill down a little bit deeper, once people often that were from the region started talking about community, it did you do get the sense that some of the ways that that working class identity and was that came out as defined by accent was there as well. So another said, still think that in the Northeast, family ties and community ties are very strong, despite the dislocations that have happened. They're still strong, and the attitude of being loyal to the group is strong. Another kind of defines that again. That sense of community is rooted in the common experience of dangerous work in the mines and shipyards. That's still around alongside, and that's connected to these big employers, a suspicion of management, a big us and them, and so a suspicion of both authority figures in general. And I think that got cut off, but also in particular situations. Another defines how that comes out in terms of accent. Don't have a particularly strong regional accent, so I never really belonged. It's always been posh for here because I don't have a very strong regional accent. But for my corps in the army, because I didn't have a regional accent, and then I was kind of wasn't 100% accepted anyway within my little clique. So the way that certainly came out was that identification with working class values that accent identified with. If that accent was there, several people identified that was really helpful in grounding them. But if it wasn't there, even that sense of belonging was diffused a bit, as you see in that last quote. And finally, and I bring this quote because it marries both that sense of community values, class consciousness, and drive to be considered working class, but also brings out the sense of humor, which is, I think, also wonderful in the Northeast, but it doesn't come out in a lot of the quotes. And I thought this was an amusing way to get at that. This person said, I think it's certainly the ethos of the people of the Northeast like to view themselves as working class normal people. You can have a Northeastern person who's a multimillionaire, but they will still tell you, and how true it is broadly irrelevant. They'll still describe themselves as a working class boy or girl who's worked hard. And they will still try, whether it's again true or not, they will still allude to the fact that they're still working class, be it in, a $1 million or £1 million mansion driving a Bentley type of idea. They'll still hold those values quite, quite close. So moving into the values that again I think exist a little bit more in the tension. Community is a little bit more diffuse because everybody noted that and how strong that was. The sense of welcome existed as described, certainly perceived within a tension with the idea that we have a firm identity. So people would say, for example, generally found the further north you get, the more friendly and welcoming, probably more in very general terms, probably more tolerant people are actually. Uh, Another, so yeah, very welcoming, very proud, very down to earth group of people where I feel at home. I'm very, very happy to live here. And this person obviously had settled there rather than being born there because they know it. But you've got to be born and bred here to be one of them totally. Another said, I wonder if I was black and from Africa, if I would have had the same experience as I've had being white. Everyone was very welcoming to me. But then again, I'm white and, conform to the society. Another says, on a practical level, it might be worth trying to neutralize if you have a strong accent from a different, what might be considered a non-working class part of the country. If you're sort of a Scouser from Liverpool or something like that, you'll fit in very easily. So I think that points to some of the ways in which there's certainly that sense of welcome, but also that need to tie that back to a firm understanding of identity that may nuance it a bit, that may nuance how that's felt in some ways. Another set of tensions in the perceived values that came out in the study was certainly grounded in a sense of pride from the region, but also a concern that there was a generational shift and a particular erosion of that sense of pride. People would say they're certainly proud of their country and proud of the past as well as the history of the Northeast. There's an element, a strong element of pride in being considered working class. You know that you are. Another, just when asked the question about the first question of the interview, does the Northeast have a distinctive set of values? Said, I'm not sure if there is anymore because generationally it's changing, I think. Another elaborated on something, a very similar theme. They don't think community life is as it used to be. Don't think, well, I don't have the experience of any time apart from telling this, but the stories you hear of the people from the congregation and people I visit, it seems that you know that it was very different. Um, so again, that sense of pride is still deeply felt. It's still deeply answered. When we talk about experiences of emotions in service, that certainly comes up as well. Um, I should note here as well, I should have noted this when I started talking about the quotations that I bring into this. Some are certainly raw expressions. I haven't gotten to too many of those yet. Um, but I've made the decision certainly to leave them as they are as such. Certainly to do otherwise, especially in terms of the veteran quotes, would really to be to break faith with them. Anger, fear, sadness, and pride all of those are expressed in this that I'll highlight exactly as they are. But that means they're sometimes expressed in strong ways. They're sometimes expressed colorfully. I've left all that language in there because I think that's an important part of recognizing that. So that will come up a bit as we move on as well. Um, there's also one of the things that came up in tension essentially is certainly the value of hard work, the deep respect in the community for physicality of that kind of work. And that was how to get ahead, but also a real tangible sense that the region as a whole had suffered a betrayal. And there was almost something owed for that. And so there's an interesting way that works out in tension, I think. So it's described by a couple of folks in the study that said, I think that it's part of the world that's not unused to hard work. Historically, all the industries and trades all seem to lend themselves to hard work. And what you find culturally, is you find there's small pockets of industrial-based language and the mindset from working in the same mine or working in the same factory or further up in the Northeast, maybe in the same foundry and so on. Another talked about the particular pride in that being the perception of the Northeast. They said, you work hard. That's what Northeastern people do. Possibly no harder than anyone else in the country, but they feel that they are working harder. As a culture, that's the minimum expectation that you're going to have to work hard. Another, in bringing up that sense of betrayal, there's almost a sense of betrayal by some of their own leaders, but I think there's a sense of not just deep down, but betrayed by those in authority is very deep and it's instinctive. That sense of betrayal, the values, not just the values of the community, but the sense of the betrayal by local government in earmarking former pit villages as actually local identity, local aesthetical celebrations, whether it be things like a brass band or banners, let alone a valuing of the skills and technical abilities, and in other industries as well. That I think has and still is firmly a part of the Northeast identity. Another simply said outright, it's a common feeling of being badly done to, and that bonds people. Finally, I think this is, or actually one more after this, but this is a really important one for moral injury. That tension between a deep sense of patriotism as well as an element of defiance or independence present in the region. Uh, I'll just let the quote speak for this. We're quite patriotic, very proud of the military service, and still are. Um, so I think it is distinct, and there's a sense of Northeast service and purpose, which I think in other areas probably gets watered down a bit. And this is, uh, I really think this next quote was one of the ones that's most illustrative in helping describe this, is they have a sense of the ethics of the rule of law. They like the fact that they live in a law-abiding country, but they're very gray about the actual application of the law to themselves when they're out on the borders even now. They see it as being done to them, which then gives them a certain amount of permission to ignore the center. Another said there's a sense that more has been given than has been received. I think that's very strong. That was in regard, I believe, particularly to military service, the industrial history of the region, and how well, as that previous slide was speaking, how well the perception was that the sacrifice of industry and how much the skills and talents that were abundant across the region are appreciated in other parts of the country or not appreciated. The North, and especially the Northeast, has been the also-rans, and they've got to fight for everything they get. So the way those will play out, we'll talk a good bit more about that when we get to the pastoral resources. Finally, I think there's a really important one for moral injury as well. Tension between the perception of friendliness as well as the perception there's a deep stoicism that particularly in areas away from urban centers. So it's described, I lived in the South when I was in the Army. A lot, you do notice the difference as you come up north that your neighbors will talk to you. You'll talk to strangers, you'll talk to people in the street more. It's that sense of looking after people more. Another said, we're tough and we're really friendly and approachable, and I think that makes us quite unique. Another, I think, begins to get at that and below the surface of that and says, I feel like we're good at being like having surface conversations with people, not sure that we're good at actually saying what's really going on and being honest about emotional trauma or anything like that. I feel like the general way is kind of talking about it on a surface level, maybe, but kind of just getting on with it without really talking about it. And that sense of, some people described overtly that sense of stoicism, as deeply characteristic of the area of getting on with it. And of course, that's not to create a caricature, but that's the way it came up several times. People from here are not the type of people to, it's got to be about the weather and your neighbor. It's like you don't talk about things that make you vulnerable and make you feel vulnerable. I thought that was a particularly evocative articulation of what that idea of stoicism might look like, particularly from a veteran perspective. So if those are kind of the thematic range of values there, the next thing I just want to lift up briefly were some of the narratives of moral injury that emerged. So I asked that question, as I said, about what emotions you connect to service, and I thought that would give interesting answers, and I'll point to a few of those because I believe it does. I can't find a better word to use for this next part, but to say the things that we would expect about, normal kinds of combat, potentially morally injurious situations. That's what I mean there by PMIEs. Those came up, certainly. But what I think that third category points to is almost almost universally, not quite, but almost universally for veterans, what they described as the more haunting experience was the poor handling of what those morally injurious situations were in combat, not the combat situation itself or the situation experienced in theater or in a war zone. So ask the question, what emotion, how do you feel about your service? Or what can you name some emotions that you connect with that? Pride certainly pops up almost immediately, is the most common response to that, but usually in fairly nuanced ways. Um, so one said, I'm proud of my service. I've been able to be proud of it in the last couple of years. In retrospect, before there was a lot of anger. Before there was a lot of anger, which there's still anger, but a lot of that has turned into sadness at wasted potential. Another said, the least is probably pride, but there is pride in there, right? Because I know you've got to recognize that the things that I did well, sadness, some guilt, some shame, it's mixed, I think. And that idea of being mixed was a very common response as well. It's a really interesting question. Hesitance, I think, because it's not something I really want to talk too much about, not because it's, carrying this load of baggage around with me. Again, that idea, nobody just said there's an easy short answer to that question. It always came out and people want to describe mixes of things. Another common ones were some describing of fun or happiness. Two things I remember, the two feelings, two emotions I have. One of happiness because I look back to some fantastic memories with amazing people. And the other one I have is acute frustration when I think about the wrong. It's not the wrong thing to think about, or when I think about something really It's usually due to the ineptitude of leadership, fundamentally. Another expressed that mixed emotions, saying, yeah, my emotions are mixed from fun, friendships to situations where to this day I still puzzle how they developed. It's like all sort of, yeah, military situations. You have the sort of fun that people can reminisce and talk about in the bar endlessly about how, fantastic it was. And then you have sort of the darker parts you just maybe put to one side and think about occasionally. And that idea that there was two sets of emotions, one displayed. There was a public set of emotions somebody displayed, even the stories they told in company, where there was almost an expectation that they would tell that kind of story. And then there was the things that were much darker that they confessed to very few people and kept mostly to themselves. So again, using this term that I really don't like, the more it pops up on the screen of what a normal combat, potentially morally injurious situation is, because there's nothing normal about it, which is part of the problem itself. It's an encounter with a situation that is horrific in its own right. So I don't want to normalize that. I'm using that only to contrast it with situations of leadership, which I'll get to in a moment. So again, here is where these situations do represent raw and fairly explicit scenarios. So just be aware those are certainly in the next few slides. When I was younger, I had a very thick skin. My mother said when I came back from Bosnia, she didn't like who I was, and that was because of coming across mass graves and being in a lot of attendance of road traffic accidents and seeing that locals had crucified old people to their door frame and set fire to the building, that kind of thing. Now, the notes, and again, the language here is raw and necessarily so, because I think that describe a lot of these things. So I was afterwards. Another describes similar situations. You're put in a position where you're sending people away, coming to, for all the reasons they're in fact coming to you. This is what you're selling, isn't it? You're coming here to our country. You're fighting. This is what you're selling. All those ideas. Then you're turning them away when they need your help most. This was at a medical facility. When they're most vulnerable and they're going to die as a result. And then we all do that. And then we turn tail and leave when it gets a bit too difficult at the very end. A sense of betrayal, incredibly common. I say this as an Afghan veteran myself, for the experience of being in Afghanistan, particularly the way that conflict ended. But turning, there was again, even if people describe those kind of things, what they often focused on as the really profound sense of moral injury was that betrayal by leadership, the failure to care, the failure to experience military in community, I think, as they would have expected to. It's impossible really to summarize these in the report, though I've tried to include as much of the relevant part of the story as I can, even in some long form. Uh, One says, I get to see my leaving reports long after it was possible to do anything about it. One says, I knew veteran was dealing with issues for a long time, but the pressure finally became too much. If you knew that, you're in command of me. Why the fuck didn't you do anything? Are you a leader? You're a blunty. And just for anybody not familiar, blunty is kind of a person that hangs back, that isn't familiar enough with the issues up front to do anything about it. The betrayal of not being looked after when I came back, the sense of betrayal, then really you just got burnt out really. But there's no subsequent, oh, so and so has just been thrashed. Had a guy, a colonel, saying, oh, we had an easy tour. It was quiet, wasn't it? Sergeant so and so can do your post-op deployment brief. But that sergeant was one of my subordinates. So I wrote his annual report. So I'm not going to go, hi, Sergeant, this happened, I'm struggling. Ain't going to fucking do that, are you? Of course you're not. So you're just sort of left on your own. So there's that. Another talked about their CEO essentially not being able to deal with their particular trauma. Said he basically set me up to get rid of me. So I signed a letter to say that I wanted to move early. And actually, I just wanted to get away from him. But because the commanding officers in the British Army have a 2.5 year tour and all other officers have a 2 year tour, so there's always different reporting going on. So you don't just get reported on by the same person. particularly soldiers, because they have 3-year tours. There's always somebody else in the mix if you can spot personality clashes and so on. And his tour bookended mine, if you will. So, sorry, that's a bit of a confusing scenario just to say it's important to get the timings right on reports and those kind of things. I was within the time period he said was there and couldn't cope with it anymore. So I went a few months early, but it was enough that my peer group noticed when I moved down to another job. And then that original CO broke medical confidence by telling my new boss about my mental health situation. So again, it's these situations of it not being handled well and not being cared for that really were the common theme of moral trauma. And it's interesting that's shared in the narratives of moral repair. This isn't as easy a question as to get to, and I want to get to some of the resources before getting too long-winded here. But there was an almost universal call for systemic change. If I asked what would make things right, almost to a person, the veterans I interviewed said, change the system so this doesn't happen to others. I will be happy if it changes and I know somebody else didn't go through the same thing I did. And a lot of that revolved around the mental health care at the end of the time in service. So just lifting up the highlighted parts of this, we genuinely feel a huge sense of satisfaction and repair from updating the mental health aspect of that system. Veterans UK and the post-service medical assessment. In fact, all physical and mental setup and having it appraised by experts. And then again, which takes us back to your institutional letdown again, where no one has the guts to say, we want to do this, but we can't afford it. So we're going to change it and have less payouts. Rather, instead, they just look at this, hey, we do this great thing, but apply at your peril. Describing there the situation where nobody will admit that it's broken so that they can fix it, they can get more money into it. Instead, we just continue to pretend that it's great. That was the perception certainly expressed by that veteran, but it was one that was shared across most that I spoke to. So amongst all those things, what do I do with that? How do we make pastoral resources? What do we do that's different from an American context? How does that inform this in any word, in any way? So one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this and that sense of community and the way that came out, it would make sense that if we came from a place that has a strong sense of community, we might have that same expectation going in to the military. That might be stronger from there if we come from a place where there wasn't that sense of community. That expectation, then in some way, and I say this word gently as well, it might make one more vulnerable to moral injury because when that expectation shattered, because that community doesn't exist as strongly as one expected it to in the military and they're not cared for. So I think that may be at play and certainly suggests that makes sense, at least in the narratives from the values to the stories of moral injury and moral repair. But also that the sense of community in the Northeast also provides a profound way in which one can seek to um, moral repair in the sense of being reminded that those moral expectations aren't unreasonable. That being in a system, being in a community that does care for each other is restorative over time. That's something recognized by clinicians as well. That being in communities that have a deep sense of care does tend to teach us over time and remind us that that does exist and that is something we can expect, and that it's reparative in that way. One of the things, and I'll talk about this more in just a moment when we get to theologies, that complex and yet strong sense of identity is very different, I think, in nature than it is in the US. The US has a very strong sense of its own identity as well, but it's infinitely more complex in both the UK and the region of the Northeast in particular. Again, those principles of being, history of being a border community, the history of industry, that patriotic and kind of defiant tension. There's all of that means, however, we talk theologically about values and contrast that with an imperial sense, as you'll see in just a moment, that's far more nuanced here than it is in an American context, my observation. That sense of stoicism, obviously in terms of moral injury, there's a point at which that's perhaps even we might say protective for moral injury. We want to deal with it in a clinical sense. But also, obviously, when one returns to a place where they perceive particularly that the value is you just get on with it and you don't make yourself, as one person said, vulnerable. You don't mention things that make yourself vulnerable. That keys that this is a particular pastoral concern for this area. If that's the perception, then how do we create spaces and how do we do things in which that can be done? And I'll talk through ways in which I've done that a bit and provided some resources. Finally, certainly there's a pride in place in the world. That sense of pride can't is really important to navigate. However, we talk about the theology, justice, and that deep sense and desire to be associated with working class values is key. That exists in certain parts of the United States as well, but it's particularly strong here. And I think there's ways in which that I'll point to that we can get at that uh, in the way I've designed some of these resources. Okay, I know I'm getting along, so I'll try to wrap this last part up because I want to hear and engage with you all about it. Just to say, I've broken up the resource section into several bits. The first is just pastoral engaging with veterans in the Northeast. Um, what is our, I've got a slide here that dropped out on preparation. There's a bit about preparing for what one's going to hear, being ready to listen, and having a strong support network. Those are all keys. Those are things that we know, but that I can use this study really to demonstrate and lay out and say, these are really important. There's critical ways in which you have to be prepared for what you're going to hear. Because if you do get someone to trust you, they are going to tell you things that aren't easy to hear. Moral injury is not caused, as we said, alluded to a little bit in the slide, by normal experiences. It's caused by horrific experiences. And even the best of us are not going to be prepared to hear that unless we intentionally do so. Then this section on posture. One of the things that this talks about is the contextualization of experiences. When I asked veterans what experience they had with chaplains and clergy, for example, a couple of them talked about how profound it was that chaplains seemed to exist on almost a different plane than everybody else. One described the experiences of um, chaplains coming and talking to them during a really intense training exercise at the end of their time at Sandhurst, where they would seem to visit them in foxholes and they're incredibly stressed. You're singularly focused on this one task in front of you. And the pastors kind of just would pop up, go from one to one, talking to people, handing out candy, that kind of thing. And it just kind of forced them to remember for a minute that this isn't all there is. Even though it feels like that at the moment, it's not. And I think that was a profound sense that that example of contextualizing experience was really important, and a key thing that most chaplains do really well is provide a different set of that. And that clergy dealing with morally injured veterans can do the same kind of thing. Um, Listening with empathetic compassion, this came up. Empathetic neutrality is often the clinical term used. I try to reframe that a bit as empathetic compassion, that what veterans, I think a lot of times, several in the study pointed out that they were looking for someone to walk them through the idea of what it meant to be guilty, what it meant to feel guilty, what it might meant to feel anger at something that somebody did that they never were punished for. How do I need somebody to agree that these acts that we're talking about are wrong, and that yet you have compassion for me and love me enough sitting in front of you to walk me through that. So there's an interesting paradox of holding firm the line that yes, we can agree, and I would agree that's a horrific thing to do, but I want to walk you through how we come back from that. I think that's what I would call an empathetic compassion that holds that framework because that's needed. There's a sense of embodied uh, priesthood. People describe seeking out somebody who had a very lived faith in the world, who was very comfortable with themselves as a clergy person, who knew their own faith, would be willing to do things like drink and smoke with everybody and show that I'm a real person. I'm not above anything. But when it came down to it, my faith was an anchor point for me. And if somebody knows that, they will be willing to talk because I think that makes a very intriguing person because they sense that that person, as a clergy member, a person who lives their faith in that way, might be willing to help them. Just something that came up a few times. I'll talk about the other two a little bit more, but I want to get to a couple of the theologies. So after that preparation and posture section, I have a long one on many theologies. And this is, again, me trying to take the theology that's been done as somebody who does it, I'd like to think well, but also from an American context and say, well, how does that differ here? How does that differ from a Northeastern one? So Rita Nakshima Brock and Gabriella Latini in Soul Repair, they talk about souls in anguish. And a lot of the time they talk about what is essentially a dualistic identity between an imperial nature and more and something else, something we want to either move to or something that exists in smaller community. And again, I think that's just incredibly complex in the Northeast. That sense of identity has building blocks that one can use that I don't think are quite as much there. It is a dichotomous thing in the United States, that sense of imperial duty versus more what we'd associate with everyday life. Here, there's a lot more, richer amount of traditions in between those two things to draw on. And I think paying attention to that just means as we're talking about souls in anguish and identifying it theologically, there's more touch points in that sense of identity than there are in the US. And I talk a bit more detail about those. Sin and agency, if you know what I do, I work a lot with Augustine on this deep sense of, how much agency do we have? Attending to those questions are really important. How we identify kind of coming to the world bound to sin in the sense of, and working out our own agency in that regard. Um, but I think one of the things that comes out here is there's a recognition too easily, I should say, and I'm guilty probably of this in some of what I've said so far. I think there's a tendency to want to say that in a military hierarchy, that sense of agency is very compromised, negated, disfigured. One of the things that comes out, and this is, it's really important to pay attention in that sense of pride that agency still exists, that agency still matters. Nobody has simply something that has had something done to them. That's there and that's recognizable. But there's an important way in which, however we talk about agency, we talk about that sense that it is certainly there, that pride and personal responsibility is there. So how do we talk about that and incorporate that into those contexts? That's certainly something that I can say from the perspective I originally wrote a lot of what I did from. I didn't take into account enough and I didn't appreciate the balance of, and that certainly comes out here. And again, I'm very much just touching on these, but I try to develop these in fairly rich ways. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I point to him sometimes in my work, is a really rich understanding of what it means to be guilty in situations where there's no good choices, where we have to accept that we're going to be compromised in some way by whatever we do. And how do we operate a sense of morality in that? And so he has this rich and nuanced way, which he talks about responsible action. I mean, sometimes we violate the commandment and the thing that in the Christian tradition God tells us to do for some sense of doing good for somebody else. That our care for the other sometimes mean we have to violate a commandment and risk the fact that God judges us for that. What I think Bonhoeffer talks to that makes so much sense in this context is being responsible in a system that we describe as rigged. We can't win this. If we follow the rules are all against us and are going to leave us in the same impoverished state. Those rules and following them continues to put us in the position where nobody reinvests back in the community, where that's not there. And veterans can feel like that, I think, can really imbibe that because that is their experience. And that is, it may even be a very honest way to describe it, what's happened to them. But that idea that action, we can still be responsible. We are still acting in those systems that are rigged. And I think we can tweak it to that language and pay attention to that and provide a helpful model for what it's like to be responsible in a way that's Bonhoeffer provides essentially a way of understanding morality that has to break rules in order to survive. And I think that makes a lot of sense in some of these contexts and the ways that the veterans have talked about it and in the background here as well. Miroslav Volf talks about justice and forgiveness, particularly in that sense of identity and making room for the other. I think this exists very much in a profound way in terms of that sense of welcome. And I think that is a helpful way to think through this. How do we root ourselves in an identity that inherently has a way of making room for another? I think that exists already in the culture here. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I think incorporating that is a helpful way to think through this. And I should say, I should have said this a moment ago, but these mini theologies are again a preparative tool, I think. This is not something that I would expect, clergy to go preach on a Sunday, but rather just something that helps them prepare how they might think about this and how they might think of this as incredibly theologically consistent work with the gospel and rooted in their tradition. Um, I'll save that last one if anybody's really interested. Ask me about memory and eschatological forgetting, because I want to move to the last section, and then I'll promise I will stop talking for a moment. Liturgical resources, scripturally, some of these are really important. Creating that space to lament, that permission to lament, that space where somebody can be vulnerable. Sometimes it's a reminder that this exists in Scripture, and this is a common among moral injury, but I think particularly relevant in the Northeast. Psalm 88, Job. Lamentations is sometimes an incredible encounter with, if we've never read it before, the idea that people blame God a lot in that for what's going on. And it's a permissive structure that that's not being unfaithful, that is a faithful response to what they're going through. I think that's a powerful reminder if people are guided into that in a way that's helpful. Recognition of difficult and unfair moral circumstances. I think both for veterans in this particular ethos that walking through the book of Jonah in interesting ways can be evocative and kind of tapping into that same thing, as well as in a somewhat broader tradition, just reframing the passion as a narrative of moral injury, um, shattered moral expectations from a lot of different perspectives. Certainly Jesus, we could read it that way, but also Peter, Judas, the rest of the disciples, Mary. There's all kinds of angles in which we can read this as experiences of moral injury. One of the things that I think is most helpful about the resources I've done that I would hope is so at least is looking at the prayers and language and how the experiences inform that in ways that might be helpful. Um, so, with apologies to everybody who works in the Church of England, this is not meant as a slight in any way. But I think traditions that are more adjacent to the formality of the C of E language sometimes really resonates deeply in particular ways. There's a long history that probably we could adjudicate in that as well in the Northeast. And that could be different, again, for different people going through. But some of those have been really helpful. What's really important as well, though, the liturgical language with ties to the Northeast, I think is really helps both ground that identity. This is a very Northeastern spirituality. It is very relevant to me because it comes from here. I think that blunts a far right criticism that popped up amongst and was identified amongst clergy participants. And again, in a feedback session we held with some folks, if this is identified as something deeply from the region that emphasized that tradition of welcome, that played on the better angels, we might say, of our historical heritage, if that comes from a deep sense of place, that it came from here, that it comes from the Cuthbert and Aidan and these distinctly northern saints, I think that has a particular way of both emphasizing that and blunting a critique of it as being something imported from a more liberal ideology. And I think there's a balance in a lot of the language in some of these prayers that I'll lift up in a moment between strength, directness, as well as a recognition of vulnerability and betrayal in difficult circumstances. And I think because they're from this particular area and lifting those up is helpful in doing so. So I've lifted up a few prayers in here just that are in the resources section from the Northumbria community. Sometimes these are published in books that under Celtic spirituality in a sense, but it really does emphasize the tradition that's the heritage of Cuthbert and Aidan and Finan and different northern saints. But the language of this just lifts up a directness as well as, I think, a way that's helpful. So one prayer is, God bless you with discomforted, easy answers, half truths, superficial relationships, so that you will live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and the exploitation of people, so that you'll work for justice, equity, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you'll reach out your hand to comfort them and change their pain to joy. God bless you with the foolishness to think you can make a difference in the world, so that you will do the things which others tell you can't be done. Um, There's another prayer. I'll come back to this one if we want to at the end, because I want to point two things at the end. Remembrance. Obviously, this is an opportunity in which to engage carefully with language, and I think one in which we often um, miss, not of any sense of malice, but it's an important way and moment in which we can pay attention to what matters to morally injured veterans. Many of them are haunted by the humanity of their enemies. We're asked to do a really difficult thing, and I think the haunting of what we've done to other human beings is a central part of that, whether directly or indirectly. In that sense, in the Northeast in particular, being on the border develops, I think, both a commonality of workers as well as a sense that our enemy is often simply the person on the other side of a line that we didn't draw, and that they're just like us. I think the sense of that among border communities is much stronger than somebody who lives far from that border, where their enemy can easily be othered in their own mind. So I think language that both recognizes and remembers British troops that were on Remembrance Day, as well as the enemy dead, is a really important way to include that. So the Church of Scotland, for example, has a prayer that begins this way: "Let us remember the kindness of God and His favor to us in our time of need, the courage, devotion, duty, sacrifice of the men and women in our armed forces, toil, endurance, and suffering of those who were not in uniform, support of those who set us help from afar, came or stood by our side. Let us remember those who were wounded in the fight, who perished in air raids at home, who fell in battle and were buried at sea in some corner of a foreign field, especially those whom we've heard, known, and loved, and whose place is forever in our hearts." And here's the kicker: "Let us remember those who are our enemies, whose homes and hearts are as bereft as ours, whose dead lie also in a living tomb of everlasting remembrance. Let us remember those who came back, whose lives still bear the scars of war, who lost sight or limbs, or," and here I substituted mental acuity for reason, because I didn't like that word, "those who lost faith in God and hope for humanity. Let us remember the continuing grace of God, whose love holds all souls in life, and who none is dead, but all are alive forever." And the last thing I want to lift up is that space and language to lament. Um, there's a couple ways in which I think this works out in particular traditions, and this is really evocative language, I should say, for me, and it's one of those moments that I hit when I deeply resonated with it. I'm not from the Northeast, but I think in that way of describing the environment where it's described as you don't want to be vulnerable, you don't want to let that out, where stoicism is such a profoundly perceived value, whether it is or not, the perception among veterans who named that repeatedly. There's language, for example, for prayers after suicide. This happens far more than we'd want to admit. But when our friends die by suicide, I think this prayer in the Book of Order from the Church of Scotland is profound in identifying language that's helpful. Um, we thank you that the name is beyond the reach of darkness and despair, not beyond the touch of your care and love. Ending of their earthly life seems senseless. We cannot fathom the anguish of mind they went through. Forgive us for those times and ways we failed them. Help us to forgive them for any hurt we feel they've inflicted on us. Help us to forgive ourselves for any harm we fear we may have caused them. I think that alone is a really profound way to get at that. It names something that's not often named in a way, in a space that I think only clergy can get at in that sense. And there's not a lot of things I'll say that about. There's a similar one, certainly for after violence, that lifts up a lot of that same language. So let me just say, path forward for resources. We will publish at least two versions of this on the website, one that has the full list of the report and the resources on it. I also want it to exist as a repository for narratives of moral injury. We don't have enough of those that exist in the research space that can be accessible, and I think that's a real value of this. And I hope this serves as a key argument for contextual studies of moral injury in pastoral care.